There was a man who slit the throats of his children to spare them from having to burn to death. As soon as he realized that they weren't going to be able to escape, he just slit their throats. The stories don't even give the man's name, so I have no way of really checking this. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, I guess that's possible.
Yeah.
Like, oof. So, as I said, on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire, Chicago lost 250 people and had 4 square miles destroyed. Peshtigo lost at least 5 times as many people and 100 times as many square miles.
Wow.
Other cities in the area also had fires the same day. It was a really bad day for fires. Property damage in Peshtigo was estimated at $5 million, which would be about $127 million today. In addition to that, 2 million trees burned, which, when your number one business is lumber, losing 2 million trees is not good.
That doesn't help you.
No. So, yeah, not pleasant. Following the fire, it actually took days for help to arrive. Local areas were there pretty quick. Mm-hmm. But by the time that word of the Peshtigo Fire had got down to Madison had already heard about the Chicago Fire.
So they had already sent people down to
They were sending their people down to Chicago. So food, clothing, and other aid were quickly sent out, much of it going to Chicago instead of up to Peshtigo. Stuff that did go up to Peshtigo actually got diverted to Marinette because it was easier to find places to hoard people in Marinette than in Peshtigo at this time. All that was left of Peshtigo were a few buildings and ashes, with all personal items being destroyed. Yeah, Chicago being like the major city, like this got this huge headlines, and Peshtigo got very few headlines because nobody knew what it was.
Right.
Like, it's a big lumber town, but it's still a nothing town.
Right.
And so, you know, and not to say that the Chicago Fire wasn't bad, because it was, but there's clearly, by every conceivable metric.
Yeah, they're not even close in scope, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
a man named William Ogden, who was involved in the wood and lumber business in Peshtigo, happened to be a politician and actually lived in Chicago. Strangely enough, right? But even though he lived in Chicago, his business was up in Peshtigo. And he was absolutely determined to rebuild the town. Mm-hmm. He said, I'm going to get the lumber business back up and running. He says, I'm going to. He could never get it quite back to what it was, but he really, really tried. So the fact that Peshtigo even exists today
was a huge part of him.
It's probably due a lot to William Ogden, who had the lumber business, wanting to keep it going.
Now, was he associated with Peshtigo just because of his business? Like, was he born and raised Chicago, but really had no ties to Wisconsin, but just wanted his business back up and running?
I couldn't tell you if he was born and raised in Chicago, but he was a Chicago guy. So, he's a politician in Illinois.
Okay.
Like, he does not live in Peshtigo.
So probably the number one driving force was just getting his business back up and running.
Yeah.
Okay.
I make a note to myself. I said, well, I wonder what would happen if the fire had never happened. What would Peshtigo be today? And we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. Like, if a city hadn't burned down and the lumber business would have kept booming, I'm almost curious, like, if it would have been a bigger city. Because now, like, again, like north of Green Bay, there aren't a lot of major cities. But maybe Peshtigo would have been one.
Maybe, but I'm going to venture on the guy side of no. Because I believe,
sorry, Peshtigo.
Like, I believe, like, Marinette probably got all of its money also from lumbering. Mm-hmm. And haven't all those cities just kind of cut back on the amount of lumber they do because they've realized the damage they were doing to...
Well, I mean, yeah, lumber is definitely not what it used to be. I think it's pretty well known that mining isn't what it used to be.
Yeah, so everything that they had is kind of, gone away a little bit.
Yeah.
So
I don't know, but okay. Well, I'm not going to push it too hard. I'm just going to say, like, I would say any city that had a major industry, like, if they invested and pivoted in just the right way, they could thrive. But maybe, I guess there's a lot of maybes in there. I don't know.
There's a lot of variables that go into it.
Yeah. The people who did live in Peshtigo and survived apparently did not give up. In addition to the Chicago businessmen, people who lived there apparently believed in the town because today, 2024, the population is around 3,500 people. I mean, not a major city, but it's there. So good on them. Why is there a discrepancy over the death count? Why is there like 1,000,
person difference?
1,000 person difference? Like, that's a pretty wide range. The 1,182 dead is the number that made it into an official report based off of who they could identify as being dead. But there's no doubt that others could not be identified. There's at least one mass grave, which is still there today. You can see it in Peshtigo, that had 350 people burned beyond recognition and just put in the hole.
Okay.
There's a Peshtigo Fire museum, and it's next to this. And for years after this, more mass graves were found in the area. So apparently at the time, like, people couldn't be identified, and because they had so many relatives who also died, they had no relatives to identify them. So a lot of them
they just started digging holes and
digging
dumping bodies in.
The population of Peshtigo in 1870 was 1,749 people. So, how many of the people, lived there permanently? How many were traveling through? Like, 'cause I imagine a lot of these lumber workers didn't live there full time. They're kind of coming and going. But if the population at the time was 1,749, and at a minimum 1,182 died, that's over 2/3 of the population gone in one night, which is pretty serious.
I mean, it is pretty amazing that they had something like this happen, and they managed to. I mean, doesn't that seem like that should have just killed that city off completely?
Yeah.
But yet they were able to build it back up, and it still exists today, which is really impressive.
It is really impressive. That's mostly it. There's one more weird part of the story.
Okay.
You want the weird part?
Yeah, of course I want the weird part.
Okay.
That's what I'm all about.
All right. So the fire's in 1871. As early as 1883, speculation began that there might have been a reason the Peshtigo-Chicago fires happened on the same day, and it wasn't a coincidence. In fact, they said, you realize there were fires in Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin all on the same day.
Okay.
Perhaps what happened is a comet went by, pieces of the comet broke off and burned and hit various places around the Midwest. All right.
Okay.
A book in 1985, 100 years later, came out again with this theory. A 1997 documentary was made on the theory. And then finally, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics did a full investigation in 2004. And they said, this pretty much isn't going to be true. They said, we have no record ever in the history of mankind of comet pieces or meteorites coming down and burning things. Like, that's just not what they do.
Yeah, and again, I listen to that and I just say, I don't know, man. The drought sounds like it's a lot more of a culprit of it than comet.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they said. They're like, we have no record ever of a meteorite or a piece of things, junk from space coming down and burning stuff. So already, like, you got to prove that because we don't have evidence of that. But they're like, yeah, second of all, we know there were droughts, and like, that's all you need.
Right.
When you've got droughts and you've got the fires from the farming, and you've got the fires from people with their